Russia's military claimed Sunday it had carried out retaliatory missile strikes on Ukrainian barracks in Kramatorsk, Donetsk province, killing 600 Ukrainian troops. Ukraine called the claim nonsense and said no troops were killed. Western reporters and Russian pro-war military bloggers also disputed Moscow's claim. The strikes on Kramatorsk were among several missile attacks Russia launched right after the end of President Vladimir Putin's purported unilateral 36-hour ceasefire from Friday through midnight Saturday to celebrate the Eastern Orthodox Christmas. There was little sign of a ceasefire on the front lines, the Wall Street Journal and BBC News report. Russia said it hit 2 temporary bases in Kramatorsk that housed 1,300 Ukrainian troops, calling the strike retaliation for Ukraine's deadly New Year's Day attack on Russian barracks in occupied Makiivka. Russia says 89 soldiers were killed in that strike, while Ukraine put the number in the hundreds. A reporter from Finland visited the schools and said they were empty, the Institute for the Study of War Research Organization reports, flatly calling Russia's claims false. Russian military bloggers also responded negatively to the claim, pointing out that Russia's defense ministry frequently presents fraudulent claims and criticizing Russian military leadership for fabricating a story to retaliate for the Makiivka strike instead of holding Russian leadership responsible for the losses accountable, ASW reports. On Sunday, December 8, Ukrainian Forces of Air Command Center struck down a Russian helicopter and a drone on the Eastern Front, most likely they were a Ka-52 and an Orlan-10 respectively. On January 8, 2023, between 11 o'clock and 1400 hours, operators of the Mobile S-300B1 anti-air missile system from the Air Command Center destroyed an enemy helicopter and a drone on the Eastern Front, most likely they were a Ka-52 and an Orlan-10 UAV, the latter of which was trying to carry out reconnaissance of our positions. Earlier on January 8, soldiers from Air Command Skid, East, destroyed an enemy reconnaissance drone in the skies over Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. On Sunday, Russian troops inflicted 144 strikes on 5 hromadas. A hromada is an administrative unit designating a city, town or village and its adjacent territories, edition, of Sumy Oblast. The Russian army carried out 144 strikes during the day on the territory of Sumy Oblast. In particular, the Esmen, Myropilya, Nova Sloboda, Bilopilya and Kodin hromadas were under fire. Russians shelled Esmen hromada 4 times with mortars, grad and barrel artillery. There were 44 strikes in total. As a result of the shelling, 4 private houses of local residents, as well as a school and a village club were significantly damaged. Myropilya hromada, the Russians fired mortars and artillery. There were 42 strikes. Russian shells damaged 5 residential buildings and a local farm. Nova Sloboda hromada was shelled by the Russian army with 120 mm mortars, there were 11 strikes. Bilopilya hromada was also hit with mortars, there were 29 strikes. The explosions destroyed 1 residential building. People were not at home at that time, this saved their lives, Zhyvytskyyy said. In Kodin hromada 18 Russian mines exploded. In all cases, there were no casualties. Russia and Belarus will hold joint tactical flight drills from January 16 to February 1. Joint tactical flight drills with the aviation units of the armed forces of Belarus and Russia, which are part of the aviation component of the Russian-Belarusian Combined Forces, will take place from January 16 to February 1, the Ministry of Defense of Belarus reported. An aviation component from the Aerospace Force of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation arrived in Belarus on Sunday, January 8. On January 5, the Ministry of Defense of Belarus stated that personnel, weapons, military and special equipment of the Russian armed forces will continue to arrive in Belarus. It was reported that the Belarusian army had received another 34 armored vehicles from Russia, which were sent to the Brest district of Belarus. On the night of 6 to 7 January, another trainload of Russian soldiers, approximately 700 to 800 people, was moved to Belarus. This train repeated the route of the previous one exactly, which, as it turned out after specifying the data, also arrived in Vitebsk on the night of January 6 and brought about 700 to 800 people. On January 6, Alexander Lukashenko, the self-proclaimed president of Belarus, arrived at the 230th Obyslesna military training ground, where the Russian unit from the Russian-Belarusian Combined Forces is stationed. Ukrainian ambassador to the U.S. Oksana Markarova on Sunday stressed that the billions of dollars in U.S. support to Kyiv in its fight against Russia is being put to good use, as some Republican lawmakers have started to question the aid. Congress passed a $1.7 trillion government funding package at the end of December that included around $45 billion for Ukraine and NATO allies. The package drew the ire of Republicans, some of whom have started to publicly call into question how much funding the U.S. has offered Ukraine. As Republicans have started to point the finger at U.S. funding, Markarova said that visits with the White House and congressional leaders during Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky's trip to Washington were very constructive and very productive. But when asked if Ukraine got assurances that American support would continue with Republicans in control of the House, Markarova did not directly respond. President Volodymyr Zelensky in a video address on January 8 said that despite Russia's attacks on both strategic cities in the eastern Donetsk Oblast, the Ukrainian military repelled the constant attempts of the Russian offensive there. And NBSP. Zelensky also reported that Ivan Syrskyi, commander of the Ukrainian ground forces, visited both Bakhmut and Soledar on January 8, giving out medals to soldiers and taking steps to improve the defense of both cities. Since the liberation of Kherson in November, Russia intensified its offensive around Bakhmut and nearby settlements. The salt mining town of Soledar, only 10 kilometers northeast of Bakhmut, is a key stronghold for the Ukrainian defense of the embattled city. On January 6, multiple Russian sources claimed significant breakthroughs in Soledar, with some saying that the city had been captured entirely. On January 7, the Institute for the Study of War reported that the recent Russian gains in Soledar do not portend an imminent encirclement of Bakhmut. Russian President Vladimir Putin was awarded in absentia by Bosnian Serb leader Milorad Dodik on Sunday, during a ceremony marking the Bosnian Autonomous Serb Republic's a national holiday. Putin was awarded the medal for the particular patriotic care and love towards Republika Srpska and merits in developing and strengthening cooperation and political relations between friendly states of Republika Srpska and the Russian Federation, moderators said. Dodik, the region's separatist president who has long favored ties with Russia over those with the West, praised Putin for being a reliable support to the Serb Republic and said he would present the medal to him at their next meeting. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Dodik had tried to block efforts of the tripartite presidency for Bosnia to join European Union sanctions against Russia. At the same time, Russian envoys have supported Dodik in his secessionist moves aimed at weakening the central government. Last month, Russia denounced the EU for granting Bosnia a candidate status to join the bloc. It has earlier warned that it would consider Bosnia's moves towards joining NATO to be a hostile act. Russia's Vladimir Putin stood all by his lonesome for Russian Christmas Mass this weekend in a Kremlin church, looking bored and dead inside, while military brass reportedly worked behind the scenes on preparations to summon another 500,000 citizens to die for him. Ukrainian intelligence warned this weekend that Russian military officials plan to call up another 500,000 citizens in mid-January, just after the New Year holidays die down. The main intelligence directorate of Ukraine's Ministry of Defense said thousands of men are expected to be rounded up in major cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg. Even as the number of dead and fed-up Russian troops swell to new proportions, Putin seems hell-bent on making battlefield bloodshed a new cultural norm for the country. In his annual New Year's address to the nation, the Russian leader broke with his traditionally festive backdrop this year to deliver an aggressive speech surrounded by men and women in military garb. And while the Kremlin may increasingly be losing the support of those who've seen firsthand the sloppy results of Putin's first partial mobilization. A man was hospitalized due to the explosion of a Russian landmine in Velika Oleksandrivka, Kherson Oblast, Kherson Oblast Governor Yaroslav Yanushevych reported on January 8. Yanushevych urged civilians to pay attention to unexploded ordnances, especially in areas liberated from Russian occupation. On January 3, 2 people were killed in an explosion caused by landmines left by Russian troops near the Berislav district of Kherson Oblast. The victims were in a car that came across the Russian mine near the liberated village of Mala Oleksandrivka, according to Yanushevych. Ukraine liberated Kherson and other settlements in the region located on the west bank of the Dnipro River in November. Yanushevych said on November 13 that Russian forces had mined nearly everything in the city of Kherson. According to Serhiy Kruk, who heads Ukraine's state emergency service, about 30% of Ukrainian territory is mined due to Russia's full-scale invasion, equal to twice the area of Austria. Cases of doors, household items, and even dead bodies being rigged with booby traps have been recorded in liberated territories across Ukraine. President Volodymyr Zelensky said that Russia's mine terror would have to be resisted for many years. Almost 8 million Ukrainians have fled the country or been displaced since Russia invaded in February 2022, according to the United Nations. Many of those people have found shelter in Europe, especially Poland, but more than 100,000 have come to the United States under Uniting for Ukraine, a federal government initiative launched in April 2022. The program allows Ukrainians who have been displaced by the war to seek refuge in the U.S. if they have a private sponsor willing to house and financially support them for 2 years. More than 2,300 sponsors, individuals and groups, have stepped up to support Ukrainians trying to build a new life in Minnesota, according to the Minnesota Department of Human Services. Hennepin County has led the way with 780 approved sponsor applications as of December 13, according to state officials, and Anoka County is next with 327. The apartment is a new temporary landing pad for Ukrainians arriving in St. Paul. It's owned by St. Paul resident Jeffrey Austin, who has volunteered with Alight, formerly the American Refugee Committee. In the past 24 hours, attacks by Russian forces in northern, eastern, and southern Ukraine have resulted in the deaths of 3 civilians and left 9 injured, according to Kyrylo Tymoshenko, deputy head of the president's office. 1 person was killed, and 8 were wounded in Donetsk Oblast, 1 was killed in Kharkiv Oblast, and 1 was killed in Kherson Oblast, he said. The attacks took place amid the Kremlin's supposed Christmas truce, which it unilaterally introduced from midday on January 6 to midnight on January 7. Russia broke its own truce within an hour of when it was meant to come into effect. Russia's President Vladimir Putin cited the occasion of the Orthodox Christmas to order the unilateral ceasefire. The Orthodox Christmas on January 7 remains the primary celebration date for most believers, although Ukraine has made the Western Christmas on December 25 an official holiday as well. Senator Angus King, Independent Maine, on Sunday called the type of fighting happening in East Ukraine essentially trench warfare, just days after he met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Kyiv. King, who is a member of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and the Armed Services Committee, told CBS Face the Nation moderator Margaret Brennan that $3 billion being released by the Biden administration to help Ukraine will assist in its efforts to stave off a Russian offensive. The Biden administration announced on Friday a $3.75 billion military assistance package to send new equipment to Ukraine, including artillery systems, armored personnel carriers, surface-to-air missiles and ammunition. King said such vehicles will help Ukrainians have a fighting chance to win the war. This new package for Ukraine is the 29th installment of U.S. arms and equipment for the country since August 2021. Other allies, like France and Germany, have also announced that they will send armored vehicles to Ukraine in support of its war efforts. U.S. President Joe Biden condemned the assault on Brazil's capital by supporters of defeated President Jair Bolsonaro, which echoed the January 6, 2021 insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. Biden has been briefed on the incident, White House officials said, and he'll remain informed of developments. Earlier Sunday, thousands of Bolsonaro supporters stormed Brazil's Congress, Supreme Court and Presidential Palace in Brasilia, protesting what they falsely believed to be a rigged election. President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva wasn't in the palace at the time. Local media reported that by about 5:37 p.m. in Washington, the rioters had been cleared from the buildings. Police said there were dozens of arrests. Bolsonaro has been vacationing in Florida. Representative Joaquin Castro tweeted that he must not be given refuge after the incident. The European Union has allocated €255 billion to implement the REPowerEU plan, a way to further reduce dependence on Russia. 8 out of 10 Europeans support this course of action, as they understand that the energy crisis is caused by the Russians. Russia was at the peak of its influence on Europe. Its energy weapon was fully loaded, with Europeans officially, according to Eurostat, dependent on Russia for 83% of their gas supplies and 50% of their oil supplies. Frau Merkel's long-term work brought impressive results. Germany was on its way to receiving 130% of its gas needs from Moscow, that is, not only giving its own businesses cheap gas, but also making money from it. Over the past 10 years, the European dream has allowed Russians to earn €1 trillion. With this money, the Russians bought electronics for missiles, and financed their propaganda and corruption. And although Russia earned its $120 billion in the EU in 2022, 2023 will be a lean year for it. Oil is cheap, while gas is nowhere to be found. Think about it, a third of the Russian federal budget is at risk. This is according to optimistic forecasts for the Russians, although there are no real figures public, they are classified.